Hello, I'm Dean Ray Johnson, and this is a board game textbook, How to Play Video for Votes for Women, a game by Tori Brown, published by Fort Circle Games. Votes for Women is a game about ratifying the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A quick United States civics lesson. The Constitution says that to ratify an amendment, you must first convince both sides of Congress to vote for the amendment with a two-thirds majority. Then you must convince the state legislature of individual states to vote for the amendment. Three-fourths of state legislatures must pass a majority vote for the amendment. Votes for Women is a battle between the suffragists, the players who try to pass the 19th Amendment, and the opposition, the players who try to prevent the 19th Amendment from becoming law. The suffragists win if you ratify the amendment, the opposition wins if you don't ratify the amendment. 1 to 4 players can play this game. The basic game is 1 versus 1, but 2 players can team up on either side, or you can replace the opposition with the Oppobot, an automated opponent, and play solitaire or 2-player cooperative against it. So what are you doing in this game? At the start of each turn of the game, players will draw a hand of event cards. Each turn has 6 rounds, and during each round, each side of the battle plays a card. You can either play a card for the event text on the card, or play a card for a generic event. Like, the event on your card may say to place cubes in specific states on the map. The cubes represent your support in the states, or you could discard any card to place cubes in a state of your choice. The event on the card may place more cubes on the map than taking a generic action, but the generic action lets you focus on placing cubes in specific states. And the suffragist side usually gets stronger event cards than the opposition, but the suffragists need much more support to win the game. Specifically, there's a Congress track on the map. It starts with none of these markers on it. Some actions add or remove Congress markers to the track. The suffragists need to stack 6 markers on this track, which represents the two-thirds support needed to get the amendment through Congress. Then the states vote on the amendments. If the suffragist players get 4 support cubes into a state, then they've convinced the legislature to vote for the amendment, and you replace the cubes with a checkmark token to show that the state is locked up. But if the opposition gets 4 support cubes on a state, then they've convinced the legislature to reject the amendment, and they place a cross token on the state to show that it's locked to the other side. Here's how the game ends. The opposition wins if they get over a quarter of the states, that's 13 states, to vote against the amendment, or if Congress hasn't ratified the amendment by the end of the 6th turn. The suffragists win if they get Congress to ratify the amendment and get 3/4 of the states, that's 36 states, to vote for the amendment. If Congress ratifies the amendment, but no one has won by the end of the 6th turn, then you roll dice for each state to determine how they vote, with the bonus for anyone that has support cubes in the state. So the suffragists could try to lock down support in as many states as possible, or they could spread out their support and try to win a majority of states in the final voting. So let's run through setup. If you want to skip setup, then look at the timeline and skip to the next chapter. You place most of the dice, buttons, cubes, and other components beside the game board. There's a deck of 12 state cards. They look like this blown up. They each have a name of a state on them. You randomly put 9 of these cards face up beside the board. The other 3 cards go back in the box, and only these 9 states will be the key states in this game. Then there's a deck of strategy cards. You shuffle these cards into a deck and place 3 of them face up beside the board. There's also a black disc, which you place on the turn 1 space on the board. And last, if there's 2 players on either side, then those players decide who's going to be the first player and who's the second player. If there's 2 suffragist players, then the first suffragist takes the purple cubes and the purple campaigner tokens. The campaigners are these voter-shaped tokens. And the second suffragist player takes the yellow cubes and yellow campaigners. If there's only 1 suffragist player, then they control both the purple and yellow cubes. There's no difference between the purple and yellow, but some cards say specifically to attack purple or yellow cubes. And if there's 2 opposition players, then they both use the red cubes, but you still need to decide who's the first player on that side. There's also a deck of event cards for each side. The cards in the suffragist event deck are marked as either late, middle, early, or start in the middle band on the card. The suffragists shuffle the late cards, shuffle the middle cards, shuffle the early cards, and then they stack the late cards on bottom, then middle cards, and the early cards on top. There's one suffragist event card that's labeled as a start card. The suffragist player draws that card as their starting hand. If there's two suffragist players, then the first player, the purple player, takes a start card, and the yellow player draws an early card off the top of the suffragist deck. The opposition does the same with the opposition event deck. If you have two opposition players, then the first player gets the opposition start card, and the second player draws an early card. If you're playing against the Oppobot, the automated player, then the players are suffragists, and you use the Oppobot event deck instead of the opposition deck. The Oppobot deck has 3 start cards, and you place them all face up on the table at the start of the game. And then also keep an eye out for a couple cards in some of the decks that say do not use versus the Oppobot. You can just remove those cards from their decks before starting the game, or draw a different card when you see those cards. So let's start lesson 1. Each turn of the game has 4 phases. I'll go through all of those phases in a later lesson. Let's start with the operations phase. At the start of each turn, the players draw a hand of event cards, and then in each operations phase, you play 6 rounds where each side must play 1 event card from their hand. When you play a card, you do one of 4 actions. The first action is play an event. You play an event card, do the text on the card, and then usually discard the card. You should probably play your start event card as your first card in the game, because it places campaigner tokens on the board, the voter-shaped tokens. The opposition start card places 1 campaigner in the south. The suffragist start card places 2 campaigners in the northeast. Campaigners move into the region circles on the map, and both sides will get more campaigners later from their event cards. The campaigners are important for the other 3 actions that you can do on your turn. Each of the other actions says that you discard the card that you played without playing the event text, and you get stuff based on the number of campaigners that you have on the map. You either get buttons, cubes, or congressional markers. And if there's 2 players on your side, you count all of the campaigners on your side for those actions. So, one generic action is the organizing action. This action says you take a number of buttons equal to the campaigners that you have on the map. The suffragists have 2 campaigners on the map, so any suffragist player could discard an event card and gain 2 buttons. Buttons are a currency that you can spend for different things throughout the game, like some event cards say you need to pay buttons in order to play its event. Most importantly, anytime you roll dice in this game, anytime at all, you can pay a button to re-roll the dice. And then if you don't like a re-roll, you can spend another button and re-roll it again. If you have 2 players on your side, then you share your buttons in a single supply between you. You could gain buttons, and then your partner can spend them. So, another generic action is the lobbying action, which affects Congress. When the suffragists take a lobbying action, they roll 1 red die, a d6, for each campaigner they have on the map. Each 6 that they roll is a success. When the suffragists take this action, they add a congressional marker to the Congress track for each 6 they rolled. When the opposition takes this action, they remove a congressional marker for each 6 that they rolled. Sorry about that. Like I said earlier, you can spend a button to re-roll your dice, but you must re-roll all of your dice that way. You can't say, oh, I got a 6 on 1 die, I'm going to save that and re-roll the other one. 1 button equals re-roll the whole thing. And remember, the suffragists are trying to fill this track with 6 markers to get the amendment ratified in Congress. The opposition wins if you don't do that by the end of turn 6. So, the last generic action is the campaigning action, which lets you place cubes on the map. I'm calling this lesson 2 because this needs more explanation. So, for a campaigning action, you roll a blue die, a d4, for each of your campaigners on the map. Then you place 1 die beside each of your campaigners. The number on the die is how many cubes that campaigner gets to put in states in the region that they're in, divided however you want. So, like, if the suffragist player has 2 campaigners in the Northeast, that player rolls 2 dice, they get a 1 and a 3. That's not a good roll. Let's spend a button, and let's re-roll those dice. They get a 2 and a 4. Much better. So then the player places one die beside each campaigner. They could place the 4 beside the purple campaigner and then maybe put 4 purple cubes in Vermont. And then they put the 2 die beside the yellow campaigner and put 1 yellow cube in 2 different states. Notice that each campaigner places cubes of its own color. Also, after you see your dice rolls, you can move your campaigners to different regions. You spend 1 button to move a campaigner to any other region. So I could spend another button, move the yellow campaigner down to the Midwest, and instead place a yellow cube in Illinois and Indiana each. What if you place cubes in a state that has the other side's cubes in it? Then each cube that you would place instead removes one opponent's cube. So if I was going to place 2 yellow cubes in Wisconsin where there's already 2 red cubes, instead I would just get to remove those 2 red cubes. Or if I place 2 yellow cubes in Minnesota where there's 1 red cube, then the first cube I would place would remove this red cube, the second cube would go into Minnesota. There's also 2 effects that can happen when one side gets 4 cubes in a state. First, there's 9 state cards put on the table at the start of each game. These are key states with a powerful base of support. If your side is the first to get 4 cubes into a state, then you take the card that has that state's matching name. You keep this card even if you go below 4 cubes later on, and then you can play that state card as a bonus card when you play an event card later. I'll explain the bonus actions when I explain all the phases of the turn. These cards also have Oppobot text. If you're playing against the Oppobot and it ever gets a state card, then immediately you do the Oppobot thing on the card and then the card goes away. 4 cubes also matters when Congress ratifies the 19th Amendment. When you place the 6th congressional marker on this track, then Congress ratifies the amendment. And then any state that has 4 cubes in the state, you immediately remove those cubes and replace it with a checkmark token for the suffragists or a cross token for the opposition. And then for the rest of the game, if either side ever gets 4 cubes in a state, you immediately remove those cubes and place a checkmark or a cross. You can't place cubes in any state that has a check mark or a cross. Those states have voted to ratify or reject the amendment, and they won't change their minds now. So, those are the 4 basic actions. You either get buttons, roll for congressional markers, roll for cubes on the board, or play the event on a card. For Lesson 3, I'm going to run through a few things about some event cards. First of all, if an event places cubes or congressional markers, then it's the same as taking the basic actions. If you place cubes in a state that has your opponent's cubes, then each cube you would place instead removes an opponent cube. And if a state gets to 4 cubes after Congress has ratified the amendment, then you switch those 4 cubes out for a check mark or a cross. Many suffragist cards have this 2-color cube icon, which means that you can place either a yellow or a purple cube in the state. When there's 2 suffragist players, the purple player can use this to place yellow cubes and vice versa. The only difference between purple and yellow cubes is that some cards specifically remove yellow cubes or specifically remove purple cubes. And the word remove on a card never means add. If you get to remove 2 cards or 2 cubes from a state and that state only had 1 cube, then you don't get to remove 1 cube and then add 1 cube. You just remove the 1 cube that's there. Some event cards have a persistent event icon, which match an icon on one of the 3 card slots on the game board. If you play a card with an icon, then it goes to the matching state. Like this 15th Amendment card has the icon that matches the cards in effect for the rest of the game space. So you play this card and it goes into this space for the rest of the game. If an event card doesn't have one of these icons, then you play the card and do the event and discard the event card. Some event cards also can't be played unless you do something else. Some events say you need to pay a certain number of buttons or you can't play that event. Other events say that you can't play an event if another specific event is in play or is not in play. Like the 15th Amendment is playable if the Civil War is not in effect. So there's a card called the Civil War that may be on the in effect for the rest of the game space that would stop you from playing this card. And then there's probably another card that says you can't play this card unless the 15th Amendment is on this space. There's also some events that have a chance to fail. 15th Amendment says to roll a red d6, and the event happens if you roll a 3 through 6. If you roll a 1 or a 2, then you discard the event without doing anything, and that uses up your card play for the round. But remember, you can always spend a button to re-roll a die, even these event card dice. There's also a couple event cards that need clarification when you're playing with 2 suffragist players. Pause and read what's on the screen if you want to catch that. Okay? Okay. So, now you've seen what you're actually doing in this game. For Lesson 4, let's go through the entire game turn. Phase 1 is the planning phase. At the start of each turn, each player always has 1 card remaining in their hand. In the planning phase, you draw more event cards. On a 1-player team, you draw to 7 cards. And on a 2-player team, both players draw to 4 cards. So both sides always get 6 more total cards. The Oppobot doesn't do anything in this phase. Phase 2 is the strategy phase. Remember how you can get a state card if you're the first person to get 4 cubes in a state and that card has a bonus action on it? Strategy cards also have a bonus action on them. In the strategy phase, whoever spends the most buttons gets to take one of the 3 face-up strategy cards on the table. First, the suffragist players spend any number of buttons, which could be 0 buttons, and they lose those buttons no matter what the other side does. Then the opposition side spends any number of buttons. And then you compare the 2 sides and see who spent the most buttons. If the opposition spent fewer buttons than the suffragists, and if you're going to spend less, then you're spending 0 buttons. There's no reason to spend any buttons if you're spending fewer. If the opposition spent fewer buttons, then the suffragists get to take one of the 3 face-up strategy cards that's on the board. If the opposition spent more buttons than the suffragists, and if you're going to spend more, then just spend 1 more than the suffragists, don't overspend on that. If the opposition spent more buttons, then the opposition gets to take a face-up strategy card. And if both sides spent the same number of buttons, then nobody gets a strategy card this turn. And last, anytime someone takes one of the 3 face-up strategy cards, then you draw a card from the strategy deck and place it face-up in the space beside the board. That's all you need for the 1 versus 1 game. If there's 2 players on your side, then the second player gets to take the strategy card for your side, and that player gets final say on how many buttons you spend. If you're playing against the Oppobot never gets buttons. When the Oppobot spends buttons, instead you roll a blue D4 for the Oppobot, and you pretend that's how many buttons it spent. If the Oppobot spends more buttons than the suffragists, then you choose a strategy card at random that's face up, you immediately do the Oppobot text on the strategy card, and you discard the strategy card. So, phase 3 is the operations phase, which is the card playing phase. There are 6 rounds in this phase. In each round, first, the suffragist player plays an event card, and then the opposition side plays an event card. Both sides must play an event card each round, either for the card's event text or you discard the card for one of the 3 generic actions. If there's multiple players on the team, then they alternate rounds for playing cards. So if you had, say, 2 suffragist players and 1 opposition player, dang it, wrong button, I'm sorry. If you had 2 suffragist players and 1 opposition player, then you'd go the first suffragist player, then the opposition, then the second suffragist player, then the opposition, then back to the first suffragist player, and keep going until both sides have played 6 cards. When the Oppobot plays a card, there's a flowchart. I'll come back to that in a moment. Also, when each player plays an event card, they can play 1 bonus card before or after their event card. So you could play a state or a strategy card before you play your event, or vice versa. So after both sides play 6 cards, you have the cleanup phase. Each player should have 1 card remaining in hand in this phase. If there's 2 players on a side, then they can exchange their last cards in hand and they can give their bonus cards to each other. If there's any cards in the left side space on the board, the in effect for the rest of the turn space, then you discard those cards now. And last, you push the turn marker 1 space forward to the next space on the turn track. If that was the end of the 6th turn, then you're probably moving on to final voting. I'll explain all of that in Lesson 5. Alright, if you're not playing against the Oppobot, then you can look at the timeline and skip to the next lesson. On screen is a flowchart for how the Oppobot takes turns in the operations phase. So on the Oppobot's turn, you flip over the top card of the Oppobot deck. Usually you just do whatever the event card says to do. There's 3 start cards face up on the table for the Oppobot. They all say on round 1 of the first, third, or fifth turn, play this card instead of drawing an event card. If an event ever places cubes anywhere in a region for the Oppobot, then you roll the white d8 to determine randomly which state in the region gets the cubes. If the card places anywhere on the map, you also roll the red d6 to determine a random region. And if the Oppobot ever can't play a cube in a state because it's locked with a checkmark or cross, then you re-roll the dice. There's 2 cases where you don't play the event card. Either if you can't play the event card, like if you don't have a specific card in play that's a prerequisite, or if the event card would do nothing for you, like if it says to place cubes in specific states and those states are all locked. If you don't play the event card, then the Oppobot plays a campaigning action. For each of the Oppobot's campaigners, you roll a red d6 to determine which region the campaigner moves to. You roll a blue d4 to determine how many cubes that campaigner gets to place, and you roll a white d8 to determine which state to place those cubes in, except if there's still a state card on the board that matches one of the states in that region. Then the campaigner always places cubes in that state to try and get the state card. And then there's some complicated stuff about what if the state becomes locked as you're placing cubes on it, which could send cubes to other regions. If you're playing against the Oppobot, I recommend you read the back page of the rulebook to double check those rules. So, Lesson 5. We've finally reached the end of the game. Again, if the suffragists ever get 36 checkmarks in states, or the opposition ever gets 13 crosses in states, then the game immediately ends and you have your winner. If you reach the end of turn 6 and Congress hasn't ratified the amendment yet, then the opposition immediately wins. Otherwise, after turn 6, you go to final voting. For final voting, you discard all of the cards until end of turn and until end of game spaces. And then basically final voting is both sides roll dice to determine who wins each state. First, the suffragist side chooses a state that isn't locked. Both sides roll a d6. Crap, that should not have been there. I'm sorry. First, the suffragist side chooses a state that isn't locked, like a state that has cubes in it. Both sides roll a d6. Whichever side gets the highest roll gets to place a check mark or cross on that state, and the opposition player wins any ties. Remember, if you have any buttons left, you can still spend buttons to re-roll these dice. If there are any cubes in the state, then you add that number of cubes to that side's dice roll. So if both sides rolled a 3, but there's 2 suffragist cubes in the state, then the suffragist player counts their roll as a 5. And then they win the state, and that's why that check token ends up there. There's a few event cards that go on this in effect for final voting space. Like one of them says the suffragists get to win tie rolls instead of the opposition, and a couple other effects. So after the suffragists pick a state and you roll for it, then the opposition side picks a state. The Oppobot will always pick the state with the most red cubes in it. You roll dice for that state, you place a check mark or a cross there, and you go back and forth until one side has enough check marks or crosses to win the game. And that's how you play Votes for Women. If you have questions, then there's a website and email address on the back of the rulebook that you can check for help. I'm Dean Ray Johnson. Thanks for watching this board game textbook, How to Play video. Y'all take care now.